Okay, so now we're back to talk more about the French and Indian War. So when we left, George Washington was investing in the Ohio Valley Company. And this company was intended to make money for the Virginians, the elite of Virginia, who had the money to invest, and the idea was it was a speculative venture, meaning Washington, Robert Dinwiddie, the Virginia royal governor, and other elites in Virginia they were buying this land, and they were getting it for a really good deal because they were friends with the governor, Robert Dinwiddie. Well, so the French are out there. Well, that poses a real problem for the Ohio Valley Company. And so Robert Dinwiddie sends George Washington out, even though he's only 21 years old. He's just a surveyor. He's not got military experience. And they want to send him out Dinwiddie sends him out to the Ohio River Valley, and with about 200 men and militia type men, and they go out to tell the French they have to leave that area because it's British land. Well, now obviously the French are not going to take too well to that, so the French want to make sure that they are staying in North America, and this part of the country makes a big difference because they need to link the Great Lakes with the Mississippi River. They also need to link all of this area around the Ohio River with the Mississippi River so that they can continue to ship from this area, which is exactly the area that Dinwiddie and Washington and the Ohio Valley Company want. So they have this, so Washington goes out. Let me see if this, yep. Okay, so Washington goes out with these 200 men, and he says he goes out, he encounters these Frenchmen who are actually out just monitoring what's going on. And Washington goes and launches this surprise attack. The Frenchmen were not expecting an attack by anybody, and so they were caught off guard. Well, the French had a lot more military forces here than the 200 men that the inexperienced George Washington has. And so it is a disaster for George Washington. This is just notes. The 7 Years' War is actually fought in Europe, the West Indies, the Philippines, Africa, and on the ocean, all the world's oceans, as well as in the colonies. It's undeclared war until 1756, so that's just extra information. So Washington and his men, these 200 men, go out and build Fort Necessity. Well, Fort Necessity is a disaster. Washington doesn't know anything about military strategy, and so he builds this ragtag lean-to basically type of fort. It's really hurried because he knows that the French are going to attack. Well, he builds it basically in a bowl. All of it's in a lower area surrounded by hills. Well, if you're in a siege type situation, you want to be up. You want to be on the hills. You don't want to be down so that the enemy can look into your fort and can look down upon you and fire on you. And so George Washington doesn't know this because he's a surveyor. He's not a military strategist. So he deals with this 10-hour siege by the French. He surrenders, and he is allowed to leave the area, go back to Virginia with his men, the ones that survive, but he's forced to leave the cannon that he took with him. So this whole Fort Necessity thing turns into a world war, basically. And it pits these people against each other. Britain and Prussia are on one side, and then you have France, Spain, Russia, and Austria on the other. Well, those are the main European forces, and it turns into a world war. The French spent so much time fighting in Europe in the French and Indian War that they didn't really worry too much about the America, the colony in America, about New France. And the British realized that this crisis demands unified colonies, which is a new idea for them, because up until this point, these colonies had been operating as separate entities. And so this is, even though this war does not unify the colonies, it forces them to work together for the short term. 1754, the British government has this Intercolonial Congress in Albany, New York. Only 7 of the 13 colonies send delegates to this meeting in Albany, but they're trying to figure out how to handle this situation. So this is, the purposes were to keep the Iroquois of upstate New York and New England, to keep those Iroquois loyal to the British colonies, and the Indians left with 30 wagon loads of gifts, including guns. So they armed the Indians and gave them 30 wagon loads full of gifts. Well, now that's a lot of money. So if you see what they're having to do, the British are having to fund here. They're not only funding soldiers and all of the supplies and the munitions, all the arms, food, clothing, shoes, all these things. They're also funding all these basically bribes, and so it gets to be very expensive really quickly. The longer term purpose is to have colonial unity to bolster the common defense against France. And this is just the image I think I told you guys, that this image was designed by Benjamin Franklin for the Albany Congress, not for the Revolutionary War, which is what many, many people think it was. South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland, and this is New England. So General Edward Braddock is sent, and Washington goes. General Edward Braddock is a British officer. He's, well respected, and so he makes a wrong call. He brings George Washington with him, and they go up to Fort Duquesne, which is basically now right where the Pittsburgh baseball stadium is on the river. And so they send these guys to Virginia. Then they're sent with, very few supplies. They take 2,000 men to take Fort Duquesne. And so the part of these people are not trained. They're colonial militiamen. The guys in the colonies were in militias. They had no army. And so these militias were for local defenses. And they were not well trained. They met monthly, but basically they were sitting around the campfire gabbing and hanging out and drinking beer and, not practicing anything. And there was no discipline. The militia, the men who were in it voted for their officers. So if you wanted to be an officer, you just had to provide the people with money or alcohol or whatever. And it really had nothing to do with military experience or prowess or anything. So they had heavy artillery to take across the Blue Ridge Mountains. They had to actually make a path with axes because there were no roads to get all of this equipment into Fort Duquesne. Long term, it opens a road to the west, which is a good thing, but where there had not been none before. The smaller Indian and French army were repelled at first by this group of 2,000 British, but they go back into the forest and they start this guerrilla warfare that they have all learned from the Native Americans. And Braddock at this point is mortally wounded, and the British suffer horrible losses. Braddock lives a few days after this first siege, and then he dies. I will post some videos to show you about the warfare, the military tactics that the British use. So basically the whole frontier at this point from Pennsylvania to North Carolina is undefended by British regulars. There's nobody. George Washington had tried to defend the frontier, and the local authorities were offering $50 for a female scalp and $100 for male scalps of Indians. 1756, the British have a full-scale invasion of Canada. They attack multiple outposts, and so you have all these blunders where the British are not doing well at all. Britain brings in William Pitt, called the Great Commoner, and he was a very admired man, and he was the foremost leader in London. He wanted to get victory at Quebec and Montreal because those were the strongholds for the French, and he gets these young leaders, and they get Louisburg back in 1758. First big victory for Britain. This is an image of William Pitt. The Battle of Quebec takes place on the Plains of Abraham in 1759 in Canada. Pitt's from Britain, Montcalm from France are the two generals that they're fighting each other. And Montreal falls in 1760, and France is out of Canada altogether. The peace agreement is not agreed upon until 1763. There is still intermittent fighting in the colonies. It's still going on around the world. But for the most part, it's gone. The fighting is over by 1760. They have a French peace treaty of Paris in 1763. The French are basically gone. They did leave behind some French population. The French are allowed to have several small sugar islands in the Caribbean, which is where they wanted to be anyway, mostly. They get 2 small islands in the Gulf of St. Lawrence that are fishing stations, so that they have trading. They can fish and have fish to send back for economic purposes to France. And they give all of Mississippi and Louisiana and New Orleans to Spain. Spain turns Florida over to the British, and the British give Cuba over to Spain. Britain now is the dominant power in North America and the leading naval power in the world. However, the colonists had increased confidence in their military ability, but were they really any better? They had fought alongside the British regulars, and the British regulars were the best trained in the world. But were they really in any good shape? Their militia was not any better trained. This war also made the colonists realize that the British were invincible because they nearly lost it early on. They call this the buckskin militia as far as the colonists. The demoralized regulars, the British regulars, were not impressed with the buckskin militia at all. And so they looked down upon the colonial regiments. They would not recognize any rank above captain for the colonials. And so they realized that there was a discrimination of the British against the colonials after this. But the colonials were very proud to be British at this point. Their idea of they would not have guessed that in 15 years they would be fighting for independence, because